Now remember this. When the horizon's at the bottom, it's interesting. When the horizon's at the top, it's interesting. When the horizon's in the middle, it's boring as shit. Now, good luck to you. And get the f out of my office.
A Pause for Cinema is made possible by the support of my generous patrons on Patreon.
I think one of the more recent moments of cinematic brilliance has to be the ending of 2023's Killers of the Flower Moon. After the film's climactic trial takes place and the eponymous murderers are forced to reconcile with their actions, the film takes a moment to break the fourth wall and call back to the way that many white Americans first heard of the Osage killings, by reenacting a live radio theater performance. The host relays the fates of the film's protagonists, how William Hale and Ernest Burkhart were initially imprisoned before being released, and then comes to Molly Kyle, Ernest's wife and the last survivor of the family who Hale and Burkhart were exterminating in order to gain their oil rights. In this moment, the radio host takes a step back, and a first-time audience might be caught off guard as the film's director, Martin Scorsese, takes to the stage to somberly narrate Molly's fate.
Mrs. Molly Cobb, 50 years of age, passed away at 11 o'clock Wednesday night at her home. She was a full-blood Osage. She was buried in the old cemetery in Gray Horse beside her father, her mother, her sisters, and her daughter. There was no mention of the murders.
This sobering conclusion brings to attention how Scorsese, a New York-born Italian-American, has no stake in the story, yet how it is also people like him, European descendant Americans, that have so often controlled the narrative over the stories being told about indigenous Americans. As a child who grew up in the middle of the 20th century, Scorsese no doubt consumed his fair share of racist tropes towards indigenous Americans in Western films that are held in high esteem even to this day.
But here is 1956. What happens? You go see a Western directed by John Ford, and you sit there, and suddenly this character, this lonely character, comes out of the desert or something, and he's absolutely terrifying.
Leave them carry off their hurt and dead. Wherever that tears it.
He just literally acts out the worst aspects of racism of our country, and it's right there.
Only recently have indigenous filmmakers started garnering more autonomy within filmmaking that has allowed them to tell the stories of their communities through their own eyes. In so doing, they are able to reject the white-authored narratives that have given them the alternating reputations of bloody savages and noble sages, in favor of something more true than many American audiences have yet seen. Scorsese's decision here is fascinating because it's part of a recent line of attention that's being drawn towards the representation of indigenous characters in non-indigenous authored narratives. While Killers of the Flower Moon certainly had its fair share of publicity, I want to look at how another film from outside of the United States tackles this subject. Alejandro González Iñárritu's latest film, Bardo, False Chronicle of a Handful of Truths.
¡Viva México, cabrones!
Bardo is an ambitious film which operates within magical realism to, among other themes, explore the historiographic role of indigenous characters in Latin America from the perspective of a non-indigenous artist. It confronts the frequent whitewashing of indigenous characters in media, pop culture, and history, and in so doing, shows how this cultural inaction is tantamount to an active participation in the continued genocide of indigenous Americans to this very day. First, some context.
I remember that at that time they were saying that the violence, why the violence and the dogs. And I said, I don't like violence that do not have any consequences, because violence has a consequences no matter what.
Alejandro González Iñárritu is a filmmaker who has been drawn to violence since the beginning of his career. While his technical style has changed from a semi-documentarian approach to the choreographed long takes of his career, he has consistently approached his storytelling through the lens of an artist who seeks out the effects of violence upon those who enact it, as well as those upon whom it is enacted. When speaking on his debut feature, Amores Perros, Iñárritu stated that,
what I wanted to show is that these decisions of these characters, in a way, he paid a price for it. There's a consequence. It's not a punish, but it's inevitable. Let's put it that way.
In Amores Perros, Iñárritu draws attention to the way that the consequence of one's enacted violence may affect not just their own life, but the lives of others with whom they intersect. A single car crash serves as the unifying force between a dog-fighting punk, a superficial ad model, and an ex-revolutionary turned mercenary. The episodes which compose the film come together to form a thesis which showcases people at their very worst: vain, greedy, and abusive, as they engage with each other through separate acts of violence, the consequences of which, by the end of the film, leaves each of them empty. This is Iñárritu acting implicitly within the genre of magical realism to set his argument to his audience. It is a magical realism which, true to the origins of the genre, works to combine a romantic fatalism with the naturalism of the real world. Iñárritu would continue this trend throughout his filmography, creating more explicit works like Beautiful and Birdman, which empower their protagonists with fantastical abilities, while remaining in a tangible and familiar world. With Bardo, Iñárritu goes even further and grants these powers to himself through Silverio, a character which serves as a proxy to the filmmaker in a semi-autobiographical film. Silverio is a journalist and documentarian whose most recent work is also a semi-autobiographical docufiction which, in discussing themes such as transnational migration and gangs, seems to be concerned with the history of violence in Mexico. In one particularly poignant scene, which is seamlessly integrated into Bardo's own structure, Silverio meets Hernán Cortés, the Spanish conquistador who, in defeating the Aztecs, oversaw the fall of their empire and the subsequent genocide of over 200,000 indigenous Americans. The scene opens with Silverio arriving to the Zócalo, Mexico City's central square. He is first met with the toppled statue of Centeotl, the Aztec deity of subsistence and the maize crop. Beyond Centeotl is a mountain of dead indigenous bodies, upon which sits Cortés, soliloquizing a poem called Petrificada Petrificante, written by the Mexican poet Octavio Paz more than 4 centuries after Cortés's death.
¡Enjambre de moscas! Fue muladar en el sagrario.
This atemporal setup is rife with symbolism, some of which might be familiar to those who've seen Iñárritu's previous works, notably The Revenant. The pyramid of indigenous bodies plainly symbolizes the titanic kill count which resulted from the Spanish conquest of Mexico, and Cortés sitting at its peak, the culprit of such a genocide. Silverio, ever the investigator, proceeds to climb the bodies and reach Cortés, where he interrupts him from his soliloquy to interrogate the conquistador on his own hypocrisy and that of Spanish rule over Mexico.
No tiene ni un libro en el cuerpo. No me conoce.
Yet the conversation that ensues between the two feels less like a proper analysis of the crimes committed against the indigenous societies of America than 2 older men bickering over ideologies. Silverio attacks Cortés using ad hominem, while Cortés shuts down his offenses by cementing himself firmly as a man of history. In his own words,
Yo construí los cimientos para un nuevo mundo. Mis hijos son los primeros mexicanos, por lo tanto yo soy su padre, le guste o no. Viví como mexicano y morí más mexicano que nadie. Lamento decirle, don Hernán, que aquí en México lo odian tanto como en España. No hay una sola estatua de usted.
His words, though true only from a Eurocentric perspective, ring with the gravity in a Mexico that remains so bound within the Eurocentric global order. Its indigenous deities, like the statue of Centeotl, have been cast down and replaced with cathedrals like the one in the Zócalo, built above the old Aztec temple. Its pre-Columbian languages have been superseded by the one Spanish language. Even the land itself is no longer Mexican, as early on in the film,
the U.S. government may have approved Amazon's plan of buying the Mexican state of Baja California.
All this to say that the genocide of the Aztec by Cortés was much more than a physical act of violence, but also a geographic, linguistic, religious, and epistemic one. The crux of the scene, however, lies in its abrupt conclusion.
A coexistir en el limbo. Vamos, no me jodas.
Vas a dejar ciego, coño, quítame eso de la carana.
As though in response to the grim overtones, gray skies, and ostentatious symbolism in the scene, Iñárritu breaks from the mood as Cortés flicks a cigarette from his fingers and onto the body of an extra.
Y deje de patalear como el niño, Silverio.
The moment between Silverio and the conquistador is then ruptured as the extra begins to groan in pain.
Nah, vosotros no queréis ser indios, ni españoles. Por elección propia están condenados a ser hijos de la chingada. A coexistir en el limbo.
The crew call cut, thus revealing that the scene which we are watching was in fact part of Silverio's docufiction production. As the camera slowly pulls away from Silverio, who is helplessly pleading for another take, the extras disregard him and even belittle him as a hack.
Yo bien, güey, aquí en el rodaje de una película de un pinche director bien mamón.
Before turning their attention to another extra who has, to their entertainment, begun climbing a flagpole towering above the film set. Just like Scorsese's cameo in Killers of the Flower Moon, this subversion works to the advantage of both Bardo as a film and the discourse with which it had just been engaged. Not only is it a clever break of the fourth wall, separating the film from its wall of magical realism and returning it to a more tangible context, the construction of a magical realist illusion through the practical means of filmmaking, but it serves as an argument for engaging with these ideas in ways that go beyond simple discourse. If the only course of action is that such dialogues are had exclusively by the upper class and bourgeois artists through such intangible mediums, then the end result will be a course of inaction instead. In the case of Bardo, both as an individual product and as a representative of the medium of film, the break serves as a reminder that we cannot solely engage with these topics through the fantastical incorporation of self-serving powers beyond our means. Though Silverio has the ability to bring Cortés back from the dead for his film, he does not have the ability to command the respect of the discourse nor the people whom it affects. And in the case of Mexico, people still keep disappearing, and the nation will continue on a path of highbrow Eurocentric figures politicking at the behest of its people.
Te dije que no quiero escucharte.
Though artists may think themselves brave for tackling these subjects through creative aesthetics like those within the realm of magical realism, their actions will be met only with the empty, meaningless applause of their peers.
Come on, louder!
And the disregard of those who face the real consequences of colonial violence. I want to be bold now and suggest that there is so much more we can do to make amends for the violence enacted upon indigenous societies by Western colonial powers. Yet to keep this discussion within the bounds of film, I'll say that producers and executives should begin taking greater chances on indigenous creatives, trusting them to tell their stories and collaborating with them so that those stories are seen. Stop funding 3-hour vanity projects told from the perspective of white settlement upon the Americas, and invest those multi-million-dollar budgets into several projects that are focused upon indigenous narratives. As audiences, we can go out of our way to watch films about those indigenous narratives, while big-budget efforts like Iñárritu's Bardo and Scorsese's Killers are formidable displays of allyship in the form of masterclass filmmaking. They are far from the only source from which to consume indigenous stories. 2015's Embrace of the Serpent, a Colombian-produced spiritual journey through the Amazon at the turning point of the 20th century, is available for free on Tubi. Eternity, or in its native Amayra, Huaypacha, is a 2018 film from Peru, the first ever to be produced entirely in the Amayra language, and it's streaming on YouTube. 2019's La Llorona is a Guatemalan horror film which cleverly mixes colonial-era mythology with a social justice campaign to recognize the genocide of nearly 300,000 Maya in the 1980s, and has just been released in 4K by the Criterion Collection. The subtly brilliant Brazilian-produced ethno-fiction The Last Forest is also available on Netflix. For something perhaps a bit more accessible, the FX series Reservation Dogs is a coming-of-age television series available on Hulu. And even though it's a big-name Netflix production, I cannot stress how beautiful of a film Alfonso Cuarón's Roma is, which is a retelling of the life of his Mixtecnani, Libo. These are stories which go beyond depicting indigenous Americans merely as victims of colonialism and instead as proactive agents in their own narratives. By engaging with them, we as audiences may testify to more than just the survival of a peoples in the face of insurmountable, vainglorious violence, and proclaim, despite the consequences of colonial violence, that indigenous Americans remain some of the most significant contributors to modern American society. Thanks for watching.